Hello. Hi. Welcome back to the house in Fata Morgana. We've finished everything but short stories on this version of the game, which is crazy. Crazy. Last week we also read A Slow Killing Poison, which was about Nellie and Arthur and Mel a little. And then Defectives, which was about Yukimasa being a bad boy. Today we're going to read some more. I preface, it may not be as long of a stream. I am hella sleepy. I woke up every 2 hours last night because I was in so much pain. I'll do my best. I'm starting to get into the silly part of being sleepy, which is good news. But let's just get into it. The Painting's Ramblings. I'm sure we all know who this is going to feature. And this is, I believe, one of the few that is told in the first person. Why, hello there, Giselle. Doing your rounds again? Such a diligent young lady you are. You could get away with cleaning this place once every couple of decades and no one be the wiser. What? You're not Giselle. That's someone else? Oh, no, you're just the maid. And who am I, you ask? Well, this is quite the pickle. What on earth could have happened while I was dozing off? You think you're just a maid, and you think you're the witch at the same time. You've forgotten just about everything, and I don't think anything I say is gonna fix that. You do seem a bit mellower now, and not so constantly miserable. Wasn't sure what to say to you before, if I should say anything at all. So I didn't say much, out of consideration for you. Not that you could really tell from looking at me, I guess. If forgetting takes some weight off you, then maybe that's for the best. Not that I think you should forget, not that I want you to forget about Michelle, but I won't blame you for choosing not to spend God knows how much longer agonizing over it. Nothing wrong with abandoning ship, especially considering how long you've spent on it. And hey, it hurt me too, seeing you in so much pain, so we both come out on top here, I guess. What kind painting, you say? Well, thank you kindly. But the truth is, I'm not nearly as upstanding a guy as people think I am. And it was us Bolingers that turned your life upside down and caused you all that misery and suffering. Yeah, I know, the first dumbfounded smile was testament enough. Everything I say is going in one ear and out the other. Which means I'm free to say whatever I want. By the time tomorrow rolls around, you'll have forgotten all about the curious talking painting you chanced upon today. So I'll start with this. It's a huge relief to see you smiling again. It's not the smile of someone right in the head, I can see that much. But it's a lot easier on the eyes and the heart than how you were before. Like I said, I'm a real winner. I'm not particularly concerned about putting up appearances here. Call me heartless if you will, you wouldn't be wrong. I'm not gonna pretend I'm some saint, but at the same time I'm not gonna play like I'm a cackling villain either. If there's one thing I don't want people to see though, it's me looking weak. I'm the laid-back guy without a care in the world. That's who I want people to see when they look at me. My big brother was your standard cookie cutter, you can count on me for anything kind of brother. I mean, that ended up not being the case, but he sure looked the part. And Michelle, he always looked up to Dee. Went to him for everything, gave him all his love. Dee was tall and well-built, muscular, everything about him screamed manly man. I kind of admired that too, though not nearly as much as Michelle did. I became a painter in part because I didn't want to follow in my brother's footsteps. Not to say I don't like the painting. I love it, but people weren't going to be inclined to compare us as often. I didn't have to be as fit as him or as good at chess. I had my own thing to be good at, art. I couldn't beat him in his own game, so I beat him in mine. And my whole not a care in the world deal was probably, at least on some level, a shield against having to admit I couldn't compare. If we were a few years further apart, maybe I could have just had the same admiration and respect for him as Michelle. But there's not much getting past that boyish competitiveness when you're so close in age. Yeah. My brothers, I believe, are that gap apart. And that's how they were. I know I've been rambling at you for a while already, but would you mind sticking around a little bit longer? Great! I've got an old story I'd like to get off my chest. This is something I was planning to take to the grave. Something I don't think Giselle ever needs to know. But well, you say you're not Giselle anymore, and I'm already in the grave, so what the hell? I'm just gonna talk to myself for a bit here, and if you kindly forget anything you may overhear, that'd be lovely. Back before I became a painting, I was the head of the Boulanger family, though I spent most of my time painting. It really wasn't the job for me, though. The guy who half-assed his way straight through life, so I left all the businessy stuff to my wife, Amy. Now, she was a real capable girl. If she'd been born a guy, she would have made him one heck of a diplomat. Possibly even caught the king's eye. Before we were married, she had a bit of a fling with Dee, which she felt real bad about later. Probably didn't help that I had a tendency to bring it up from time to time. Not all the time, just occasionally. But that aside, she was a faithful, hard-working partner. It didn't take long for us to become known as the dope and his able bride, to which Amy would always interject, "George is a very capable man, thank you very much." Now that probably makes it sound like I just shoved all the work on running the house onto her, but in truth, she wanted the job. She quite enjoyed it. Who was I to complain? I didn't mean to make him country there, I'm real sorry. that voice is a step away from Sonic, but it's also a step away from becoming very Midwestern. And also, man, I had to deal with one of the family's more significant dilemmas. Namely, my mother. Not to be crass, but Mom was not quite all there. She'd always been a bit of a nervous wreck, and it didn't take much to set her off, but it was what happened with Michel that finally broke her. Mom had, I guess you could say, a very particular image of what she wanted Michel to be, and he ended up not fitting that image. Now, you're probably thinking, that doesn't seem like such a big deal, but it is. I just can't tell you why. Michel has to be the one to tell you. Anyway, some bad stuff went down, and at the end of it all, Mom was constantly hovering over the edge. Dad gave up on her entirely, and I just wasn't sure how to approach her, so I kept my distance. May was the only one in the family who would actively engage with Mom. So while she had betrayed me once, I'd come to trust Amy again. We had a couple kids, I turned into a doting father, and life was swell. All my problems swept under the rug. Mom's condition, Michel. I left it all to Amy and enjoyed a pleasant, carefree life. But then Giselle, or I guess you're the maid now, not long after Michel died. My oh my. You really aren't Giselle anymore, huh? So back to my rambling. Michel died and I got furious at Dee over it, but I kept coming back to that. Who really deserved the brunt of the blame in that situation? It's nice and comfy to sit back and do nothing. You can throw blame around all you want. It wasn't your fault after all. You're not the one who killed him, you know? It wasn't long afterwards that Dee died too. Killed on the battlefield. I was told he died a very noble death, but I couldn't help but think he was in a hurry to escape. Listening to the news, I kept telling myself I shouldn't have snapped at him like that. Shouldn't have blamed him. Dee had to choose between protecting Mom or protecting her brother, and he settled on Mom. He was too hard-headed to come up with a way to protect them both. Though, even if he had, it was too risky. He served the church directly, and we were all under its thumb. If word spread that one of our own had supposedly sold his soul to the devil, that would be the end of the Boulanger family. I wouldn't have escaped unscathed either. Losing both of my brothers in quick succession crushed me. And as I started breaking down, it was, you guessed it, Aunt May who comforted me. It's terrible what happened, but it's not your fault. I was around when I began sensing something was off. I mean, she'd had a thing with Dee. You'd expect she would have been bawling her eyes out right alongside me. So why on earth was she so calm? But I didn't press her on it. I knew I wouldn't get an answer, even if I did. And I also didn't have much of a right to question Amy when I was pushing all my problems onto her. Doubly so knowing that opening my dumb mouth was what had done Dee... Wow, was what had done this to Dee in the first place. Yeah, like I said, I'm really tired. Too many A vowels in a row just got me for some reason. And before long, we went back to our normal routine. About 8 years after Michel's death, Mom was gone too, and the Boulanger family was down to me, Aimee, and our 2 sons. I had started teaching the boys how to paint, and I loved every minute of it. And then one day I started feeling unwell. My fingers would get kind of tingly, such that holding a brush for long periods of time would hurt. So gradually, my time time spent both teaching and painting dwindled. Even leaving the manor became difficult. At first, I just thought it was a little strange, nothing to be worried about. But then it started getting real bad, and I'd be stuck in bed for days at a time. We called a doctor to look at me, but he couldn't find anything wrong. Aunt May said I must be overworking myself, and she made me these nice, hearty meals, hoping to bring back my energy. But my condition only got worse. Eventually, I started losing my appetite. But Aunt May, she insisted I eat anyway, or I would never get better. So you know what I did? I tossed out the meals she made when she wasn't looking. I sent my younger boy out to town to buy me food in secret. And for a while, I ate that instead of Aunt May's meals, making sure it looked like nothing had changed. And after a week or two, the tingling in my fingers started going away. I could only laugh. Laugh and grit my teeth, and then cry my eyes out. I made a life with this woman, trusted her, and she goes and does this. Anger and sorrow were drowned out by raw heartbreak. My firstborn, he was getting to be about that age he could take over, which is why I had used my younger son to run errands for me. I couldn't be sure the two weren't working together. I was at a total loss. What are you supposed to do when your wife's trying to poison you to a slow death? Even now, I'm not sure what the right course of action in that situation would have been. Maybe I could have banished her, had her punished, but remember, I was only head and name. She handled everything, and there was no way I would have been able to pick up the pieces after throwing her out. And if my suspicions were right, and my older boy was in on it too, getting rid of Aunt May wouldn't have solved anything. What then? Spend the rest of my days living in fear of my own family? I was, by that point, worn pretty thin, both physically and emotionally. Every thought led me to the worst possible outcome. I couldn't, for the life of me, come up with a workable solution. Eventually, I got it into my head that it was punishment, and I deserved it. Obviously, what Aunt May was doing wasn't right, but my hands weren't exactly clean either. Maybe Mom could have recovered if I had looked after her. Maybe Dee would still be alive if I had put myself in his shoes instead of just snapping at him. Maybe if I had given everyone the care and attention they deserved, Michelle wouldn't have had to die. Burying your head in the sand doesn't absolve you of responsibility. And when I finally realized how great a sin inaction was, it was far too late. I'm dumb, short-sighted, and I hated myself for not figuring that out sooner. It should have been stupidly obvious what my action and inaction were doing to the people around me. I should have seen all of this coming. Yeah, Aunt May had betrayed me, but she wasn't the only one guilty of that. When I was going through Michelle's stuff after his death, I came across a painting that had been torn to shreds, that I had made. By refusing to use my head, I had done something that denied his identity. And he left this world still carrying the pain I had caused him. By the time I had come to that conclusion, I wondered why I was even alive at all. I couldn't blame anyone for wanting me dead. So I started eating Aunt May's meals again, knowing good and well it would likely kill me. I didn't stop sending my younger boy out, though. Just not for food. I also strongly encouraged him to move out and become a court artist. Then I started painting again. It was going to be my final piece. Every day, the tingling in my hand spread a little farther. My breathing grew a little more labored. I was afraid I might not finish while I was still able to get out of bed, but somehow I managed. It was the most harrowing experience I had had painting something in my entire life. True to her facade, Aunt May stayed at my side until my last breath. She held my hand tight, giving me a strange smile. It didn't occur to me at the time, but Aunt May always seemed to be smiling no matter what. In a way, it's kind of impressive how she managed to keep up the loving wife act while simultaneously loading me up with poison. Tell me, Aunt May, how deep did your poison flow? When you were looking after Mom, did you talk about Michelle? Knowing you, you probably figured out he was still alive. And I bet you read his final letter to her. It was you who pushed her to set everything in motion, wasn't it? There were so many things I wanted to say, but I stayed my tongue and made these my parting words. I loved you so much, Aunt May. So I ask you this. Keep my last painting in memory of me. I have no idea if she actually did as I requested, but the last thing I saw before I passed away was her nodding, a smile on her lips. The paint I used to make it, I mixed with a special something I had my younger boy go out and buy for me. a substance that, according to what I was told, slowly dissolves into the air, making it toxic. And it has some sort of reaction with the paint as well, turning it almost black. I'm quite proud of how it turned out, if I do say so myself. It was a gorgeous landscape painting. Sorry for rambling at you for so long. That's the end of my story. Were you even listening to me? What? You have to go clean the fireplace. Well, alright, don't let me keep you. Just please make sure you forget everything by tomorrow, alright? I'm counting on you. I know, why even say anything, right? I wanted to tell someone, I just don't want anyone to actually know about it. The human heart's a big ball of contradictions like that, you know? You don't? Oh, okay. Well, see ya. It'll be another few decades before you come by again, I imagine. And when you do, will it be our first time meeting again? Will you even be able to hear my voice anymore by then? Maybe it'd be best if I forgot everything too. Who knows? So long, maid. And take care. When an angel comes to judge me, how will his scales tilt? Towards forgiveness or towards reckoning? But you know, I don't want it to be an angel who makes that decision. No. You don't have to be an angel. You don't have to be an angel at all. It's so good! That's such a good... Alright, I'm awake now. It's such a good story. Listen, if The House in Fata Morgana was 10 out of 10, Requiem is 11 out of 10, Reincarnation, I would give a 9 out of 10, short stories, 12 out of 10. These are so good. He fucking poisoned her back. Get him! Fuck him up! George, baby, I love that for you. I love that for you. Forgiven. Done. Forgiven. But I love that you get that insight into the fact that Ame was kind of still in control of everything, and that was likely the tilting turning point for what happened with Michelle and Giselle at the end of door 5. So okay. All right, let's just get into the next one, huh? This one, before we start in this one, the title of this particular game is The House in Fata Morgana, Dream of the Revenants. And if you're wondering who the Revenants are, your question is about to be answered. And I hope it's worth it. I sippy sip my hydration drink and I click the button. Whew. Yeah, you know it's that tree. You know it.
Farewell, Jacopo, until our souls cross paths once more in the boundless sphere of fate.
Goodbye, Morgana. She believed that was the end of it all. That by releasing their souls from the curse, they would all return to their rightful places. That the realm containing the cursed mansion would dissipate, and the natural order of the world would take care of the rest. Both she and the good-hearted young man who had guided her to her salvation believed that. But the young man underestimated how strong his love was, and the girl underestimated how wholly and thoroughly he blamed himself. He sent her off, and then remained in place. He could not forgive himself for what he had done, and so he did not deserve to move on. Yeah, you know it's them. It's them. It's their dream. The next thing she realized, she was in a field of gold. Wheat rolling in the wind like a golden ocean. The sky blue as sapphire. The breeze almost startlingly warm. It was an unbelievably gentle view. and one she did not recognize. She had never been to this place before. Never seen this place before. Yet looking out at it now, she felt emotional. It was almost terrifyingly beautiful. And as if drawn in by it, the girl took a step forward. With each subsequent step, the soft sound of crunching beneath her feet grew more distinct. Evidently, her soul had begun taking physical form. And it was her body from life that the golden ocean created for her. She raised her left arm, which had been severed before she was placed in captivity. It was whole. Still uncertain, she placed a hand on her cheek. There she found none of the scars or the rough texture of the markings that had caused her so much torment in life.
What's going on here?
She was perplexed. Where was this place? When was it? And what was she doing here, in that form, no less? The girl continued walking, in spite of her consternation. In spite of herself, at that. It was the gentlest domains that had always caused her the most pain. The most pleasant memories were the sharpest knives. If her life had taught her one thing, it was that. And from then on, she had done everything in her power to eliminate those things. Which was why she had locked the warmly inviting master bedroom in the cursed mansion and threw the key into the painting. Oh yeah, that's right, she did do that. But now, she was being drawn into another such realm. She felt as though she needed to push forward. And soon, as she approached the far edge of the wheat field, she caught sight of a figure. Seeing it, she stopped dead with a gulp. She knew what this world was. It was his world. Much like she had crafted her own realm to contain her curse, he too had built himself a world of illusion. Upon reaching this realization, a flood of images and memories rushed over her. But this was not unusual, as she had experienced projections of others' memories in the cursed mansion as well. The living and the dead perceived the world differently. For while the living were bound by their bodies, the dead were bound by recollections and emotions. Nonetheless, it had been Michelle, not her, who had dived into the memories directly. So this was her first time truly experiencing the phenomenon herself. Though she was uncertain as to whether the experience was intensified by her own involvement in these specific memories. They were of her as a child, of the young man applying ointment to her face every day for 3 years. She would claim it unnecessary, insult him, complain in any way she could, but still the young man came back the next day. Even on days she fought to the point of truly angering him, he still applied the ointment. He was a strange man, she thought. For what purpose did he pay her so much mind? No other men wanted to get near her. The hideous scars covering her face were quite an effective deterrent, and most would probably cut off their own hands before volunteering to touch them. He alone was different, though. One day he chastised her for making the trek to the graveyard every day, in rain or snow or anything in between. But she realized now that his criticism applied to him as well. In the pouring rain or the midst of a blizzard, in winds so strong they could knock a grown man to the ground, or even when he was hurt or sick himself, he never missed a day coming to find her at the graveyard. Next, she saw the rising sun, being carried on his back, traveling a different path home than the one she knew. The stench of decomposing flesh, unavoidable in the alleys of the slums. Her surroundings utterly repugnant, yet the sunrise oddly enchanting.
The sun's light reaches even this deep, dark corner of the world. I mean, of course it does, but I don't know. For some reason, it seems particularly bright today.
Oh, that was Jacopo. I'm so sorry. It's hard for me to know. Listen, I don't have Requiem memorized for good reason. Refuse to do that to myself. She said nothing in response, but she felt the same way. She had spent her whole life looking down at her feet, never taking the time to look up and appreciate the sky. And she likely never would have either. Never been able to see the beauty in the rising sun without a nudge. Subsequently, whenever the evil lord would show her himself in her dreams, she was able to close her eyes and block him out, until eventually she was no longer able to remember his face or the sound of his voice. Her wounds were at last beginning to heal. He had given her so much. An ordinary life, an ordinary happiness, the freedom from having to be special, and warmth she had never before known. But those memories, only served to salt her wounds. Every image of the slave boy showing her kindness was another crack in her foundation.
I can't. He killed me.
With the same hands he had used to treat her wounds, he later took her life. It tainted all her memories, shattered the illusion of warmth, ruined her all the way down to her soul, turned everything into hatred and anger, a fury so intense that even the young saint's unconditional love was insufficient to assuage it. The only reason she had managed to maintain her composure at the very end was because Michel was there with her, holding her hand. She would not have gone to see him at all otherwise. But now she was alone, so she would leave. She had no interest in seeing that man again. And when she made to head back the way she had come, she caught a glance at the shadowy figure's condition. It was beaten and broken, crumbling away. She looked down in silence on the shadow, which barely maintained its own form. She had seen souls decay to this state before, such as Michel's when he arrived at the mansion after centuries lost, broken down and reformed again and again, with only Giselle's voice as his guide. By the time he had found his way there, he was unrecognizable. Hardly a wisp of a spirit, incapable of individual thought, blindly following Giselle's lead. She understood why Michel's soul had taken so much damage. He had been abused and mistreated to an unimaginable degree his entire life. It made sense that he would wish for an ending more permanent than even death. But him...
What are you doing so broken?
She could not understand what had brought him to this point. He was the perpetrator, a monster. No matter how kind he had been to her before, that did not change what he had done after that. So what did he think he was doing looking so mangled and beaten? If she left him there, before long his soul would disappear for good, rubbed out of existence, never to return to the boundless sphere of fate.
Good. Let him.
She bit her lip. Yes, let him. Then she would be free of his torture once and for all. She would never have to see him again. Never have to torment herself with thoughts of him. And what a relief that would be. So she tried to turn back, but her body would not let her. An emotion she did not understand had welled up in her breast. It was pity, though she could not put a name to it herself. It was an emotion she had never felt during her time as the witch. And in fact, were the witch here, she would have cackled joyously at the sight, pointing a skeletal finger at the pathetic thing he had become and telling him how much he deserved it. She was no longer that witch. And furthermore, she had been blessed with unconditional love by Michel and Giselle, and the benevolent portion of her soul, which she had rent from herself to create the white-haired girl, was beginning to return to its rightful place. She thought she heard a voice call from within, telling her that only she could save him. She frowned. Why would she have to save him after all the pain and suffering he had caused for her? The voice within spoke. Michel had stepped forward to save her after all the pain and suffering she had put him through. Giselle, too, held no grudge after being imprisoned in the mansion by her for centuries, happily joining Michel in his quest. She took a single step forward. The wheat swayed as she did, making the scene even more dreamlike. Initially, she had been irritated to find him here, trying to hide from his sins in this realm of illusion. But now she was beginning to realize that that was not the case. His memories and feelings flowed over her, with more clarity this time. This was what he could have had if he had not made all those mistakes. And this was the place he had hoped to show her one day. He was not hiding from his sins. He was attempting to atone for them. He had condemned his sins, lamented his failures, and forced himself to look at this vision of the world he had let slip through his fingers. Again and again, until it had destroyed his soul. This was his punishment for himself. And not only for what he had done to Morgana, but her other half, the white-haired girl, as well. She had said in a letter that she wished to see his homeland, and he had failed to see through as well. Twice he had broken what he was supposed to care about most. Twice he had crushed her. And he could never forgive himself for that. Not even after she had released him from her curse.
You truly are the biggest fool in all the world.
She had never in all her time seen more of a disaster of a man. she right, though? Get him. Though she was beginning to realize that part of the reason he had done this to himself was because she had rejected his offer to make amends. Told him she would not punish him any further. Not to mention, he was not entirely at fault for his actions in his second life. She had wished to see his life in ruins. She had, in a sense, placed him on that path herself. But he was not the one who could place the blame for his actions on others. Everything was always his responsibility, and his alone. He was like that in his first life, and in his second, and in the illusory alternative scenario where Michelle intervened. Ultimately, I'm the one responsible, he said on their march to atonement. And I suppose, to make sure their lives go a little better, he said, excluding himself from any potential redemption.
So what, though? That doesn't change what he did. Are you saying I should have sent him off with a smile? That I should have set aside my hatred to make the man who hurt me feel better?
She took another step toward the amorphous shadow, still unsure of her own position. The closer she got, the more she wanted to run away. What would she say? What would she do? She had not an inkling of an idea. Not a single fully formed thought about what came after this. The shade noticed her, lifting its head. She tensed up. It was hideous, hardly even recognizable as human. But she could tell, somehow, that it was smiling at her. It must have been made up of all the things he had wanted to do for her, she thought. The shade seemed to think she was part of the illusion. In that case, she thought. In that case, she could just play along with it. Pretending she was another phantom in this dreamscape would reduce the pressure on her, giving her time to think. Though in truth, she likely wanted to indulge in that fantasy herself. The long-lost possibility of nothing going wrong, of him finding their homeland, even knowing it was all a sham, an insignificant sliver of a dream, she still probably wanted to partake in its warmth. And maybe then, she would be able to give him a genuine smile.
So, what's on the agenda for the day?
Initially, she only intended to play along with the illusion. But in time, she found herself being drawn into the dream world as well. A fantasy where he had never become the Lord, she never the witch, and both of them lived uneventful lives in their undiscovered homeland. It was pleasant and peaceful. She soon began enjoying it in earnest. She had turned off her mind, simply started accepting things as they happened, which she was only able to do because he was hardly recognizable as him. She felt like she had really gone back to being a 16-year-old girl. Like she had grown up a normal life, not filled with tragedy. And oh, how wonderful that would have been if it could have been true. He asked her to sing for him, so she brought him into the shade of a large tree. He told her he had borrowed a lute, but he held nothing in his amorphous hands, so she merely played along. In his vision of this realm, there were others like us for him to borrow from. They sat down in the shade of the tree and sang, only her voice to carry the tune. Like Michelle in the same condition, the shade was barely able to produce any coherent sound, let alone music. But still, she could tell what he was trying to say, and how he was saying it. The longer she spent in the realm of illusion, the more her own state of mind reverted to those days. The 3 years when she had been able to experience happiness like anyone else, but continuing until she reached the age of 16. She was smiling and laughing, though she hardly even realized it herself. Nor did she recall that she had explicitly told him previously that she could not smile for him. In time, she even found herself able to speak of her younger days, something she had not told him even in life. How she was known as a saint, how her blood had miraculous powers, and the people of her village began worshipping her for it. She had, on some level, wanted to talk about that with him in life, wanted to open herself up more to him, wanted him to know more of who she really was. You're just an ordinary girl. He spoke in an unearthly voice, like thousands of rocks scraping against one another. But to her ears, it was the sound of the young slave man's voice. His slightly exasperated, always gentle tone. She smiled.
You've said as much so many times now that I'm almost beginning to believe it,
she said, wondering if he would have he would have been the one to give her warmth if things had gone differently. Obviously, that was but a hypothetical future, and one they could never have reached, no less. But she had softened up enough to entertain such silly fantasies. She also thought about her homeland. Not the small isolated village where she had been born, but someplace farther up her bloodline. Her real father's home. Would you like to meet him? She was telling him of her father when he suddenly asked her that. She was not sure, and she racked her brain in consideration. It was not something she really needed to think about. There was no family here for her to find anymore, after all, but she had indulged herself so deeply in the past that reality was not a concern. She spoke of her father with a hint of sadness in her voice, to which the shade responded with a sudden surge of rage. The whole dreamscape warped around him, and the metallic smell of blood permeated the region. He wanted to seek out her father and mete out divine justice, and the world twisted to fit his image.
Any form of violence is forbidden,
she shouted, attempting to calm his fury.
Not even if it's for my sake,
she continued. Any time he had managed to obtain any form of power, it had led him down the path of destruction. He knew no other way to wield it. And because doing so had shown to be effective in accomplishing his immediate goals, he had never bothered to look for any other solutions, which ultimately resulted in him being unable to trust anyone, because he only understood power as a blunt object. He was a soft, cowardly man deep down. But because he learned to kill,
I don't want you to hurt anyone else, ever again.
The more he hurt others, the more he hurt himself. This was a lesson that was long, long overdue for him. The shadow stared at her in silence for several minutes, as the blood and fiery rage twisting the illusory realm slowly receded. When it was gone, the shade too seemed to have returned to normal, nodding and saying, "All right, I won't." She let out a sigh of relief. She had slipped entirely back into her childhood. They talked more about everything and nothing, such as the Midsummer Festival, the memory of which filled her with yearning for those times, when everyone was still together, him, his friend Maria, his companion Gratien, and the eternally cheerful Jaren. She was never terribly fond of gatherings of that many people, and that had not changed even now, but she was able to reminisce about it and admit that it had not been entirely awful, that it had been an important, formative moment of her youth, and probably the same for the rest of them as well. The three girls holding hands and dancing in a circle, him playing a tune on the lute, and his friend providing a beat. It was a marvelous day. As she reflected, she realized he had been chasing overly ambitious dreams from the very beginning. All his talk of going out into the world, of taking her with him, and he was no different here in this realm of illusion. Eventually, she grew tired of hearing his fantasies, telling him, "Climb down off your high horse and adjust." If he was going to keep chasing after stupid dreams, she would laugh at him every time. If he was going to keep chasing after the impossible ideals, she would drag him back down to earth. That way, he would never. Then I'll just have to find a new dream.
Excuse me?
Her mouth hung open in a mix of exasperation and shock, and perhaps a trace of anger. She wanted to shout, tell him how all his idiotic dreams ended with him in shambles, but he seemed unable to pick up on her trepidation, continuing unfazed. "I'm going to win your heart." She stood aghast. That was the last thing she had ever expected to hear from him, even knowing this whole world was his fantasy about what he wished he could have done for her. She was conflicted. She felt many things, but flattered was a line she would never cross. No matter how much she had reverted to her younger self here, her present self still remained.
You murdered me. There's nothing you can do to win my heart. Not a single thing.
She found herself very close to saying what she felt, but she set her agitation aside to let the dream continue a bit longer, for her own peace of mind more than his. From that point, he became almost impressively brazen, even asking her to call him by his name. To which she frowned and said, in no uncertain terms,
"Why would I waste my breath?"
visibly disheartening him. After some time having to watch him mope, she could bear it no longer and attempted to raise a new subject. But whether she asked him about learning to play the lute or going fishing together, the only response she received was a half-hearted nod. She sighed at a complete loss. And then the shadow spoke. "Will you say my name?" Again. Why was he so fixated on such a stupid, insignificant thing? But as he continued, she realized his request was more pitiful and heartfelt than she could have ever heard from him. "I don't want you to forget." She gasped. "I don't want you to forget me again." Cracks developed in the shadow. "I don't want you to forget what I look like." It wavered, shook, crumbled. The sound of my voice. But still he pleaded desperately. "Or how I feel about you." The man who refused to lean on anyone was begging her for validation. "I don't want you to forget what we talked about." They were all things she had long since forgotten about him. What kind of man I was. Things she had locked away in the deepest recesses of her mind. Or all the time we shared together. Memories overflowing with so much warmth they hurt. Please. She cast it all out. His name, his face, everything. "Don't forget me." Which was what had allowed her to mistake him for the Lord. She felt a chill listening to the shade beg and plead endlessly. What was she supposed to do here? At the very least, this meant the end of this peaceful, trouble-free illusion.
"Why would you ask me that now?"
she said, her voice strained.
I was hoping to.
She was hoping to bask in the illusion a while longer. The shadow said nothing. It simply sat there, waiting for her answer. She mulled over the question for a while, and took another step toward it. She was close enough to touch it now. But she would never do that. A feeling welled up in her breast, a mixture of wanting to scream, burst into tears, and throw things around like a small child. She forced it back, looking down on the shade.
If I had remembered, would anything have been any different? Could we not have ended up so far down the wrong path? If I had gone and found you, would that have stopped you from becoming what you did?
There were 1,000 things she could have done differently. If, after taking up at the cottage at the lake, she had gone into town even once, she could have found out that they had a new lord. Maybe he was the one who had sent that knight to visit her cottage, who she had sent away without talking to. Not to mention, if she had only told him about her childhood, the rumors about her blood having healing powers, he would have been able to make the connection between her and the lakeside witch. She had done something. Maybe she could have stopped him from veering off the straight and narrow. In fact, she was likely the only person who could have stopped him.
Why am I blaming myself for his mistakes? He's the only one responsible for his choices.
She did not know what to do. She had been at a loss ever since learning the truth. The answers had only brought her more pain. And so she had buried them away somewhere out of sight.
That must be why.
That must have been why she had not yet returned to her rightful place. While she had been brought unto salvation by the hands of an angel, ceased being the witch, the girl inside was as wounded and suffering as ever. Can I hold your hand? The shade resumed its pleading. Its desperation clawed at her chest. And so, rather than coldly denying the request, she found herself saying,
"Do as you please."
The shadow slowly extended its hand up to hers, as if scared. It was not playing its part very well. This was supposed to be a dream where nothing had gone wrong between them after all. But the illusion had begun to give way to harsh reality. The reality of having murdered the girl he loved. The reality of having been brutally abused and killed by the man she had leaned on for support. They had both once cared for each other in a very similar way. Yet the end result was not love, but terrible tragedy. He was terrified to show someone affection with hands that had only ever brought destruction. And so before he did, he said, "I promised I wouldn't touch you without permission." She knew it was just an excuse, though, that he was simply afraid. worried about putting his bloodied hands on her, that he might hurt her again, that he might corrupt her, that he had no right to. But he overcame all that, gently placing his arms around her, as if he had been waiting centuries for this moment. It was an embrace of many things: love for her, deep regret, and, most of all, atonement.
He's wanted to do this.
In his arms, she could feel everything he felt.
Since the day I locked his soul in that mansion.
She thought back to that time, the unfathomable amount of time she had spent as the witch, a force of pure hatred and vengeance. His was the last soul she entrapped, and when she did, he was little more than an amorphous shadow. It took many, many years for him to regain a human form, but even then, he was unable to move or speak. He simply wailed something incomprehensible at her, again and again.
At the time, I thought he was saying how much he hated me.
But she was wrong. He had simply wanted to atone, but he had no idea how.
Look at you, a grown man shaking like a fawn.
As the shadow embraced her, it trembled, sobbing loudly into her shoulder. She had never seen him cry before, though she was unsure if this counted since she could only feel it through the nebulous shade.
Sometimes I can't tell if you have a heart of stone or glass.
Her entire body went limp. All the tension in her nerves released at once, and she felt like a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders.
Though I suppose I'm not terribly different in that regard. Unable to even speak my heart unless there's no one else around. Unable to face you except through this childish fantasy. Not even able to show any vulnerability.
Maybe. She hated to even entertain the thought, but perhaps they were more similar than she wanted to admit. Sometime long ago, in the memories she had banished away, he told her that being close made people more open with each other. And it turned out he was right about that. She began to speak, to tell him the truth of how she felt, letting spill forth the raw pain within, holding nothing back. She told him how she despised him more than anything in the world, because he showed her happiness and then the depths of despair, that she had no idea what to do with him. How she did regret some of her actions, such as misdirecting her anger. He was consumed by regret over what he had done to her, but he was not the only one who had regrets. As their minds and spirits intermingled, the true shape of her wounds grew apparent. He had hurt her, but she had hurt him too. She had blamed him not only for his own sins, but the sins of another man as well. And for that, she had laughed at him, cursed him, mocked him for trying to show something resembling care for another human being. Again and again, and again and again and again and again and again.
I should have known better than anyone how much he was capable of caring, though.
She thought back to that decisive moment. Knowing the truth now, she finally understood the full effect of the things she had said, to an even greater degree than Michelle had told her. She had told the man who had spent 3 years looking after her, coming to apply ointment to her scarred face, rain or snow, that she despised him with all her soul, that he had ruined her life. She had not been seeing clearly at the time, but he had been teetering on the edge as well, and her saying that had been the final push.
It was my words that ultimately pushed you over the edge, wasn't it?
How had it all ended up like this? Why did they have to hurt each other so much? What was the turning point that sent them so far off the path? He continued holding on to her for some time, pleading for a chance to make amends, spilling his heart, clinging to her like a little child. It was something he could have never done in life, or even in death. It was only after repeatedly crushing himself beneath overwhelming regret until he was mangled and hardly recognizable that he was able to show her his weakness, that he was able to show her his tears. But it was far too late. It was all over. Nothing he asked for was something she could give him. No matter how much he begged, she could never stop hating him. could never forgive him. Fissures began to form in her spirit. Memories of her youth brought with them emotions long lost, of the times she first directly acknowledged his kindness. It was a bitter, sweet, agonizing, suffocating, innocent feeling.
Many, many ages ago, when I was still a child, I looked up to you.
The sunrise she saw that morning carried on his back only seemed as beautiful as it did because he had shown it to her. She then grew to yearn the lost homeland he spoke of, admire his lofty dreams, and feel warmth in his hands as he spread the ointment. That was when the seed was planted. Not only of the ability to feel joy, but love as well.
I might have even had some fondness for you.
And having said that, she noticed the clear droplets rolling down her cheeks. After Michelle finished unveiling the truth, she shouted, I cried for him in a frenzy, and those tears she had shed contained all her feelings for him. On the day of her 12th birthday, that terrible, tragic day, she cried and told the man in the slave cart, I'm sad because I didn't get the chance to show my gratitude to people very dear to me. And that was true. She was grateful to not only the young slave man, but to the girls of the brothel as well. She had wanted to open up to them. But the larger portion of her tears were for just one person. She cried for him. She cried for the man who had spent so long trying to help her. She cried because she had not been able to thank him. She cried because she believed him to be dead. She cried for him then. So who did she cry for now? Were these tears for him as well? Were they for herself? No, they were for both of them. She decided to let the illusion continue on a while longer. She knew it was foolish. She had mixed feelings about being here and interacting with him, as she had when she was younger. But she had softened up enough to not simply ignore the warmth it also made her feel. She had found it in herself to accept the seed of kindness sprouting within her. She had found it in herself to acknowledge how he felt. So she would use the dream to lead him to his next destination, under the guise of him holding her hand and leading her, out of the claws of this foolish fantasy, to be released once and for all. She would guide him back to the void, that boundless sphere of fate, so that he may live again. They set off through the fields of waving gold. She squeezed her eyes shut, envisioning the young man she once knew. And when she opened them again, he was there, holding her hand and smiling softly at her.
You know, Jacopo, I really hope we don't ever cross paths again. Nothing good could possibly come from us meeting in the next life. I'm tired of having to deal with you. I hate you. And I pray I never have to see you again. But should you wish to see me, and should that wish take priority over my own, promise you'll treat me well. And if you can manage that, then I
can only laugh. He cared about her so much that he fucking overwrote all that. Like, he did a lot wrong, but that he did right. It's fine. Alright, I really would like to do Lost and Pain in the same session. fuck it, right? Like, let's just do it. See what happens. I'm feeling more awake. We're gonna try. We're gonna make the attempt. This one, rather these next two, are like peak writing to me. They are like writing goals. And like this next one features a bond between two characters that I don't think is talked about enough. And I wish was talked about like a lot. And every time I see art does them together, I'm like, yes! Yes! Alright, let's get into it. Oh, ding. Ding dang dong. My slippers are so warm. Too warm. Okay. Alright. Let me refill my I gulped down so much water. Fill it up again. It's fine. Alright, let's do this.
Master? I was wondering...
Oh wait, this is not. What does New York sound like? Ayo, I'm walking here.
Master, I was wondering if I could have some time off.
One autumn afternoon, a young maid stood in Jacopo's study requesting a vacation, effectively signaling her intent to quit. He lit a cigar with practiced motions, took in a deep breath, and then blew the smoke out in a long, slow stream. Again, he thought, making sure not to let it show on his face. What's your reason? He asked.
Not satisfied
with how you've been treated? I feel we've been quite generous.
Oh no, not at all, she said. In fact, you've been much better to me than my previous house. I have no complaints about the treatment I've received.
Then why? If I knew you would quit so soon, I never would have hired you in the first place. But you've just started showing some improvement. Now all that time and money's gone to waste.
I'm sorry.
I'm asking for a reason, not an apology, he said. His voice a mixture of exhausted, irritated, and scolding that only made the girl recoil further. He let out another heavy sigh. Are kids these days all this soft? Christ, he thought. Another complaint to add to the mountain built up and locked inside.
It's because,
Out with it. You know I don't like it when people aren't straight with me. The young maid looked up at their master apprehensively. His dark brown eyes seemed to pierce straight through her soul, making her feel like she was being squeezed from the inside out. Other maids had told her he was a lot softer than he used to be, but she couldn't imagine it at all. He was a rich, unmarried, testy man in his 30s. Everything about him was terrifying. Yeah. And despite that, she was willing to face up to him and beg to quit because there was something even worse in the mansion.
The head maid scares me.
Jacopo raised an eyebrow. He had been expecting her to say he scared her. Did the head maid do something to you? He asked.
No, she didn't.
Then why? Ash fell from Jacopo's cigar. His irritation levels were rising. The young maid looked up at him, fear in her eyes.
Are you not scared of her too, Master? Her appearance never changes at all.
The past few years, there had been an increase in maids quitting for vague, non-specific reasons, and he finally had his answer. When Jacopo purchased the mansion, he was 22 years old, taking the first step into expanding his family's influence to the New World. Expectations for him were high, and the pressure was almost suffocating, but he was still an optimistic, ambitious young man at the time. He had to do this, and he had to do it right, and it was that determination that allowed him to maintain the softness in his heart beneath the tough businessman demeanor, which was probably what led him to hiring the mysterious maid he found in his newly acquired estate. She was there when he first stepped through the door, calling him master and showing him around the property. Then once she was done, she started working. Jacopo wasn't sure what to make of the woman, but she seemed to know what she was doing, and over time his suspicions slowly transformed into respect. Where's your master? He asked.
My previous master passed away, she said with a perfect smile. As the new owner of this mansion, you are my current master.
Assuming that meant the previous owner had just made no arrangements for her to transfer anywhere after he passed, Jacopo decided to let her stay and work as she wished. It was the responsibility of those with power to give work to those without, and he felt some satisfaction in taking her in. And for more than 10 years, she did that work almost flawlessly. And as long as she wasn't causing trouble, he didn't see any reason to pry into her personal matters. How long she had been here, why she had worked as a maid, or even who she was. He had never bothered asking her anything. But now he was 35, and the maid still looked to be in her early 20s, just as she had the day she arrived. Or he arrived, rather. Jacopo leaned back in his chair, staring absently up at the ceiling, watching the smoke from his cigar waft upwards. The young maid quit, it was long gone, probably living with her family. He considered introducing her to a new house, but he'd had so many maids quit on him, he was running out of acquaintances to foist them on. There was a knock at the door. He leaned forward and said, "Who is it?"
"It is I," came the voice of the head maid.
He called her in, and the woman stepped through the door, was indeed identical in appearance to 13 years prior. She floated gracefully to the center of the office, not making a single sound. He felt almost like he was watching a ghost.
"One of the younger maids left today," she said, "so I wanted to discuss with you how we should proceed redistributing the work."
"I leave that to you, as always. I'll take care of finding a replacement."
"Yes, master," she said with a bow.
Usually that would be the end of the discussion, and she would dismiss herself. But for some reason, she stood there unmoving, her deep, unreadable eyes of jade locked on his. "What is it?" he asked with a frown, mildly uncomfortable.
"Have you considered dismissing me?"
she said, wearing the same faint smile she always had on. Her face was like a perfectly carved mask.
"I know that the maids have been quitting because of me. They've seen what I look like, and so rumors have been going around. The young girls are especially impressionable, so they are more likely to believe them. Have you considered dismissing me?"
Jacopo tapped his cigar against the ashtray on his desk, then leaned back in his chair. He had considered it before, but he always came to the same conclusion. Every other maid could quit, and it wouldn't slow down work as much as losing you.
"Oh my, you think quite highly of me."
"I know a capable worker when I see one, and you're more than capable. Hell, sometimes I wonder if you've been doing this job for hundreds of years."
My,
she said, her smile widening.
"You jest. If I had been a maid for hundreds of years, that would make me a ghost."
"Well, aren't you?" he almost said. 5 or 6 years ago, he might have been able to chalk it up to good makeup, but 13 years wasn't something you could just hide like that. Jacopo didn't like talk of ghosts or the supernatural or any of that nonsense, but it had reached a point he simply couldn't think of any natural explanation. "Why don't we have a little chat? I'd like to get to know a little bit more about you." Her eyes went wide at his proposition. It had been a while since he'd seen her make a face other than that pristine smile, but even her surprise seemed artificial. With her, only the most restrained of emotions came across as genuine.
"Is it going to rain tomorrow, master? You have never shown an interest in me before."
"Indeed. You might want to set your overcoat out."
"Now, what was it you wished to know?"
"What are you?" he asked, not dancing around the question. The head maid gave a little giggle in response.
"I am but a mere maid, master."
"Yeah, that's about what I figured you'd say. Next, who was your previous master?"
"He was a very precarious man, drifting between man and beast."
"What the hell's that supposed to mean? Doesn't sound like a very good master to me. Did he even pay you?"
"No, sir. The house was in shambles at the time."
He let out another long stream of smoke. When on earth was she speaking of? When he had bought the property, it was a little outdated, but otherwise in good shape. If he took her at her word, that would have to have been at least 30 years ago. He wanted to press her further, but he knew she would just laugh and brush the question aside. So he took another puff of his cigar and asked, "And who was before that?"
"The father of 2 adorable little children. He was rarely at the house, though, so his wife, son, and daughter served as my masters. They were a noble family, and they treated me quite well."
I didn't know nobility had lived here."
"My, you believe me, master?"
"Oh, so you realize it sounds ridiculous, do you?"
"I understand that it may be somewhat unbelievable to you, yes."
"Well, I'm not completely taking you at your word, that's for sure. This is just a casual conversation after all, and I know we're all prone to some embellishment. So, who was before that?"
"The siblings' grandfather. He was the man who taught me how to be an abigail." I mean, a maid. He loved roses, and I would often go out and admire the flowers with him.
Jacopo twitched at the word rose, a reminder of a great mistake he'd made years ago. He snuck a glance at the window, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I see." "All right," he continued. "Who was before that?"
Before him was...
Her gaze drifted upward, and then a rift formed in her persona, barely perceptible, but it didn't slip past Jacopo's notice. She still wore that eerily flawless smile, but hair-thin cracks had appeared in her jade eyes, allowing a carefully hidden murkiness to seep to the surface. For a split second, she seemed to be wearied to her core, looking out toward a faraway land she could never reach. And then it was gone just as quickly.
Before him was my dearly beloved, whose return I am still awaiting. For that reason, I hesitate to call them my master. I am terribly excited for their eventual return, though.
"Sounds complicated," he said. "I won't pry any further." She gave a wide smile. It was best just to leave it at that, he thought. They weren't friends. She was a maid, and he was her master. "Next question. And I don't know how I've never asked you this before," Jacopo said, letting it hang in the air for a second. "What is your name?" Saying it out loud only emphasized how ridiculous a question it was. He'd had this woman in hire for 13 years without so much as knowing her name. Peak Jacopo. Peak Jacopo. Only him. Even Yukimasa would have asked the name. With every other maid, he knew their name, age, family history, and more before they even signed the contract. But her, he never even had a contract for her in the first place, which was unthinkable for a man who didn't even allow himself to make the smallest of mistakes. He had no idea how he could let this happen. The only explanation he could think of was some unnatural power diverting his attention from it.
My. You can simply call me the head maid, as you have all these years.
"I'm the master of the house, and I'm telling you to tell me your name," he said in his unflinching business voice. To which she gave him the same smile as ever. And then, when she offered him the name she believed to be her own, the air in the room seemed to crack.
My name is Morgana, master.
Jacopo's eyes went wide. While he wasn't as prone to shouting now as he had been in his emotionally troubled 20s, God, that's a fucking mood! That was enough to push him over the edge. "No, it's not!" he yelled, unsure why he was so certain. There was another crack in the air between them. He lurched out of his chair, the force sending it toppling to the floor. She, meanwhile, only looked mildly surprised. "No, that name does not belong to you."
"Oh my, then to whom does it belong?"
She giggled. Every second he spent in the presence of that stony smile felt like a knife to the heart. By any reasonable measure, she was in the right. He had no place to deny someone else their name. But deep down, he just couldn't accept that name is belonging to the head maid.
"Master, your hand."
He looked down to see his fist clenched around the still-lit cigar. The faint smell of burnt flesh rose up from it, though he didn't even feel the heat. Jacopo threw the crushed cigar to the ground. He had no idea why hearing a single name had sent him into such a frenzy, and not having an explanation only agitated him further. "I think that's quite enough conversation for one day." "Oh, oops. I'm so sorry."
"I think that's quite enough conversation for one day. Please just call me the head maid as you always have. Now do excuse me, master,"
she said, and Jacopo could only watch in silence as she drifted out of his office. Jacopo's wife's bedroom was on the second floor, next to his own. Specifically, the room she had used in the early days of their marriage. In response to the information she shared with him by a good friend, which he trusted blindly, he had moved her to the first floor. And then, still unable to trust her, he had located her to an entirely separate building on the property. Her room on the second floor had remained untouched since her disappearance. Knowing she was sensitive to sunlight, he had had heavy, light-blocking curtains installed on the windows. And then, so the room didn't feel too gloomy, he had furnished it with white fabrics and light wooden furniture. And it was all still there. He included the room in the maid's daily cleaning duties, but many of them considered it a waste of time, so occasionally it would be neglected. In the past, he would have yelled at them for that, but now he just gave them stern reminders to do all their assigned work. Which worked, though he could tell they weren't pleased. No one actually believed his wife would ever come back. After losing everything at the age of 26, he had set out in search of his missing wife. Both with his own 2 feet and by hiring private investigators to look for her all across the globe. But even after so many years, he had nothing to show for it. Jacopo was beginning to think himself that she would never be back. But he wouldn't give up, for any reason. She had waited steadfastly for him, even after being broken mentally and spiritually. So he had an obligation to do the same. It wasn't worth much, but it was the least he could do for her, being the one responsible for hurting her so. He wished to have just one last chance, to see her again and atone for all the damage he had done. That was the only thing keeping him alive, now that he had nothing else. He stood quietly in his wife's bedroom. On the desk sat her phenakistoscope, yellowed for over the years. He could still see her calling at her phenakis wheel, with a gentle smile on her face. The same smile he had stolen from her and crushed under his feet.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
He could hear her voice as clear as the day they had gotten married. Hers was a soft, almost musical voice, the sound of which he would never forget. It's a pleasure to meet you. Oh, oops.
It's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Michelle.
They first met on the day of their wedding, in the waiting room. She was wearing a veil at the time, so it wasn't until they made their vows that he saw the brilliantly affectionate smile on her face. A perfect match for her name, he thought, which came from the archangel Michael. There was no one for whom an angel's name was more appropriate. Maybe one person. But now the pieces had come loose with the head maid's earth-shaking proclamation. And they were coming together to form a different picture altogether. On the day Jacopo met his wife, somewhere deep down he felt as though he had known her sometime long, long ago. That he had been searching for her that entire time and had wanted nothing more than to bask in the light of that smile once more. And he would do anything to make sure she never lost it again. He saw a vision of a forlorn graveyard he had never seen before. A young girl crouched before a makeshift headstone, turning back to look at him. Her smile, the same as the woman he had married. His eyes went wide, and he thought he was crying, but they were perfectly dry. He had long since lost the ability to weep. Was Michelle really your name? Jacopo's soul was bound by 2 sets of chains, weighed down by 2 great transgressions. He could feel them both distinctly. He understood how terrible the things he had done were, and that he deserved no redemption. A few days later, Jacopo was returning from an on-site inspection and decided to pass through the garden on the way. A woman with long black hair crouched before a small flower bed, practically blending into the night. Hearing her master's footsteps, she stood up, brushed the dirt off her fur skirt, and gave him an ever-flawless smile. "Good evening, master. What brings you to the garden this evening?" "I was looking for you," he said. "Oh my, you have not been yourself lately, sir. Is it love? Because I am afraid my heart already belongs to someone else." "That's not funny. My heart's already taken too, and not by you." She giggled impishly. "You are quite right, master. You would never tell the object of your affection I was looking for you." "Hey, that's your boss you're talking to." Jacopo sighed, glancing over at the flower bed. I love them being besties. Stop it. It's so good. Besties, Giselle and Jacopo. The bro TP of all time. The whole area had once been a magnificent rose garden, but he had ordered it destroyed 9 years earlier. Enough time had passed that he was able to grow out of his irrational hatred of flowers, though. And so it was the head maid's efforts that had brought it back to life, though on a smaller scale for the time being. "I apologize for what I did to the rose garden," he said, which elicited a bewildered stare from her. His gaze still averted, he continued, "You were fond of the roses too, weren't you? You mentioned coming out to look at the flowers with one of your previous masters, the nobleman, wasn't it? And now that I think about it, you were the one who looked after the garden the most as well." The head maid let his words hang in the air for a few moments, then gave him a quizzical look. What has gotten into him? She thought, but giving it a bit more consideration, she understood. He had had plenty of time to reflect on his mistakes, so perhaps an apology was not so surprising. She had grown numb to the passage of time that she had forgotten Jacopo was just a young businessman still getting his feet wet when they first met. so green that he had seen no trouble in hiring a mysterious maid who refused to talk about herself, eventually assigning her the position of head maid. Power, influence, business relationships, restless nights, constant betrayal. The pressures of the life he'd chosen had corrupted him. And then, in the wake of a great tragedy, he had managed to rid himself of some of that corruption. But only after he had lost the two people to whom that change would matter the most.
"You need not apologize to me for anything," she said. "As a matter of fact, I bear some fault myself for failing to see the truth. I could have stopped you, Master, and I could have prevented the destruction of the rose garden, too."
"You're just a maid," he said. "You were in no position to see anything I couldn't. I should have caught you onto Maria's scheming sooner, and I should have trusted my wife."
"The truth I failed to see was not theirs. It was yours, Master."
"Mine?"
"Yes. I failed to see the kindness and love in your heart."
Jacopo glared at the smiling head maid like she'd just told an offensive joke. If that were true, I wouldn't have been so obsessed with money and personal gain. I wouldn't have killed my closest friend, and I wouldn't have abused my wife.
"Were your monetary desires truly as selfish as you claim?"
He clenched his teeth, turning away from her clear jade eyes. If he felt like she was looking straight through him.
"You wanted the money," she said, "for your homeland, your family, your friend, your beloved. Am I mistaken?"
"Yes, you are," he spat. While it was true he had wanted money for all those things, they were not his only motivators. He'd also wanted it for the power, to put himself on top of the world, safe from anyone who would betray him. But eventually, money and power changed from the means into the goal itself, sending him far off the path. Had he simply kept his eye on his true objective rather than obsessing endlessly over how to protect himself, he could have done more for both Maria and his wife. The head maid gave him a somewhat melancholy smile.
"If you so insist, Master, then yes, I am mistaken. Nonetheless, it is all in the past now, and neither of us can take back the choices we made then."
Precisely. He could say it was all supposed to be for his wife or Maria, but what would that accomplish? Nothing. Allegedly noble intentions didn't excuse the kind of pain he had caused. He let out a short sigh, casting all those thoughts aside. "I was looking for you because I need you for something."
"Yes? What can I help you with?" she asked.
He turned his gaze toward the mansion, staring up at a tall, long-abandoned tower. It seemed almost radiant in the light of the full moon. "Come with me." When Jacopo purchased the mansion, it had already gone through repairs to bring it up to a habitable condition. There was just one area that remained conspicuously in disrepair. Initially, he was planning to have the strange decrepit tower demolished. There was no point in having it repaired only to sit unused, so he wanted to replace it with something actually useful, like a storeroom. But for some reason, which he still didn't understand, he could never bring himself to destroy the tower. The entrance to the tower was at the back of what he called the Second Great Hall, a mostly unused hall near the back of the property. There were rumors among the maids about strange sounds and ghosts and blood dripping from the ceiling, going as far back as when Maria was still alive. Back then, he recalled telling her it was all nonsense and that he had no interest in you women's little ghost stories, but the truth was, something did seem off about the hall. Not in a frightening or unsettling way, though. Being there, he felt smothered with guilt and shackled with sorrow. So he avoided going to the Second Great Hall as much as possible. He hadn't even had lights installed in the hall, so stepping through the door felt like entering an entirely isolated realm of darkness. Jacopo and the head maid each carried oil lamps to light their way through the hall. At the far end stood a door not opened in countless years. Just an ordinary wooden door, though, with a simple lock, not a heavy metal one with a complicated three-key lock. As he unlocked the door with his master key, the head maid whispered,
"Why did you bring me here?"
She considered following it up with, "Were you too scared to come on your own?" But even she couldn't bring herself to make light of things in the tower's presence. "I started paying more attention to you recently, after the last maid quit, and I noticed when you're not focused on something, you're looking toward one of two places, the former rose garden or this tower. So I thought it would be best to bring you with me when I came to see the tower."
"I see."
The inside of the tower was black as the abyss, even darker than the hall leading to it. The light from their two oil lamps revealed a long, long spiral staircase leading up, and something stirred in the long frozen heart of the head maid at the sight of that staircase. Jacopo set a foot on the first stair, pressing down on it hard in several places. It let out low creaks under his weight, but didn't seem to be in danger of breaking. That said, it was still an abandoned tower, at night, and nobody knew they were here. This was a terrible idea that could go wrong at any time, and he knew it. Watching him slowly climb the stairs, the head maid's chest grew tight. For an instant, she wasn't seeing him, but someone else. They were holding her by the hand, running up and up and up, and... Why did you want to see the tower? She said, trying to bring herself back to the present. Hell if I know. She tilted her head. He almost never acted without a clear reason. All I do know is, I got the strangest feeling I would find something about myself here. I see, she said, putting on a smile. I too have a strange feeling that I will find something of myself here. Climbing the decaying staircase was a long, arduous process. Every so often they passed a window carved out of the stone wall. The light from the moon illuminated the path before them, guiding sinner and prisoner ever upward. After more revolutions than the head maid was able to count, the end was finally in sight. But there was one final obstacle before they could reach the door at the top. The next section of the staircase had collapsed. Shall we head back? The head maid asked. If they were to attempt to proceed, one of them would undoubtedly slip and take a fall straight down into hell. Surely Jacopo would realize that there was no way forward and give up. But she was wrong. Leaning against the stone wall for support, he placed his right foot on what little remained of the next stair, and then he carefully guided his left foot to the next. Several slow, meticulous steps later, a chunk of stone gave out under his weight, tumbling downward into the abyss. But even that was not enough to stop his determined procession. She watched him in silence. She was not afraid that he might fall, however, because if that were to happen, then that simply meant he was fated to die here. It was an insignificant detail to her. As long as she was able to wait for her beloved to return, nothing else mattered. But he made it across the collapsed region unharmed. It seemed the mansion was not ready to be rid of him just yet. He turned around, shining his oil lamp over the gap. You're free to wait there.
No, she said. I will accompany you.
She then gracefully lifted her skirt off the ground and followed the same crumbling path across the chasm he had. When she finally made it across, he gave her a smug smirk. Damn, and here I thought you were going to float across like a ghost. I guess you really are alive. To which she responded with a little smile. They resumed their climb, soon reaching the top level of the tower. Beyond a door half rotten away sat a chamber with a single window high upon the wall. My bad. Time to drink water, I think. Through it shone a pillar of moonlight. The two of them entered the chamber, proceeding to the center of the room. The air inside was far colder than the autumn night they had left behind. It chilled them both to their bones, to their souls. Jacopo stood in place, gazing up at the window for some time. Then he walked up to the stone wall, dropping to his knees in front of what appeared to be nothing at all. He traced the irregular surface with his fingers, his hand slowly forming into a fist and dropping lifelessly to the hard floor. She could hardly see a trace of the powerful, wealthy businessman he was in that slouched form. He seemed so much smaller, on the verge of withering away.
Did you find that something about yourself here? She asked, her voice carrying well into the cold, empty chamber.
Yeah, he said, his voice shaking. There was far more contained in that single syllable than she could ever hope to discern. For a moment she thought he was crying, but from the glimpse she caught of his face, his eyes were dry, though he looked pale as a ghost. She stepped toward him, gently placing her hand upon his back. And then she spoke, breaking her personal vow to remain an observer.
If you wish to end your life here, I can offer you my hand.
The man spun around to face her. There was neither anger nor surprise in his eyes, though. Why would you say that?
I do not know, she said. Seeing you there on your knees, the words simply came out. I felt as though that was what you wanted.
She lowered herself to her knees as well, so their eyes were at the same level. He flinched but did not avert his gaze from hers. You're right, he muttered, barely audible. There was a time when I did want that. A long, long time ago. but still I descended those stairs. I couldn't let myself just toss aside what I had sacrificed everything to attain.
Even knowing there was only suffering to be found at the bottom?
That's exactly why. I had to own it, just like I have to own my mistakes now.
I see. Then I shall observe and see where this path takes you. Ah, what a wretched man, she thought, smiling.
She was an experienced enough maid to know to keep that thought to herself, though. And she herself was also a wretched woman who had wanted to die alongside her love at the top of this very tower. But in her broken mind, those memories had been transformed into a fairy tale. The full moon had begun its descent by the time they had left the cold chamber. At the collapsed section of stairs, Jacopo crossed first, as he had going up. The head maid then made to follow after him, but was instead greeted to his hand extended across the gap. She tilted her head. Obviously, he was offering her assistance in crossing, but she had made it over with no difficulty the first time, so she couldn't understand why. Not to mention the master of the house had no obligation to help a lowly maid. But bathed in the glow of the moon, her hand stretched out to take his, before she realized what happened. They had both lost those they cared about most, and when their fingers touched, he saw a bright, spirited young woman with an infectious smile, and she saw a kind-hearted and sometimes sarcastic young man. Giselle and the slave, vestiges of their long-forgotten selves, bursting forth for the tiniest, most insignificant of moments.
Michelle, to tell you the truth, I wanted nothing more than to descend these stairs with you, hand in hand.
Morgana, to tell you the truth, I wanted nothing more than to go back to those days when I could still take your hand. By the time the head maid had made it across the collapsed stairs, the shadows of their old selves had disappeared without a trace. Only the maid, who always wore a smile, and the forlorn businessman remained there in the tower. A faint connection had formed between them, though. A shared isolation and emptiness. An empathy as similarly damaged souls. But that too would fade in time. Their connection as fleeting as an autumn night. With him leading the way, and her following behind, they descended the spiral staircase together. "And what about you?" he asked. "Were you able to find that something about yourself here?"
"Yes," she said. "I believe I did, but I fear it will slip through my fingers again before long."
"You never struck me as the forgetful type."
"I have been for some time. I have no room for new memories anymore."
"Well, that's probably for the best," he said.
"It would be best if you forgot what you found here as well."
"Not a chance."
My, she said. "You are quite the intractable one."
"I could say the same about you."
"Say, master."
"What is it?"
"I want to tell you something before I forget the things I felt tonight."
"Yeah?"
"I was not terribly fond of you when we first met."
"That sounds about right."
"But that is not true any longer."
"Is that so?"
"It is. The truth is..."
Oh, whoops. "Truth is, I thought you were creepy as hell at first. Didn't even want to look at you."
"That sounds about right."
"But that's not the case anymore."
"Is that so?"
"Yeah, it is." Peak fiction. Peak fiction. Shaking my desk. Peak fiction. It's so good. Their relationship fascinates me. Because, like, Michelle and Morgana are very similar people, as we know. Giselle and Jacopo are not. They are not similar people. But they have, like, very similar experiences in that they both lost somebody very important to them. Excuse me for a moment, I need to blow my nose. Anyway, and so they like reacted to it in like very different ways. And it's fascinating. How can you not love talking about them as like not a pairing, you know what I mean? Like those two interacting with each other? Peak fiction. Speaking of peak fiction. I just want to see, hold on. I don't think I've read any of these, except maybe this one. I read all of these. I don't remember what this one is, but I know I read it because I remember the title. I remember what these are. These three. And this one, obviously. This one, I couldn't. All right, we're just going to get into this. This is a lot. This one's a lot. This one's, okay, okay. God. Oh boy. Okay. So in ending 4, we haven't done the endings. I originally was going to do all of them. At some point I would like to still, but that's going to take me a while to get those save files ready. So if you remember, as Michelle, there's a timed response at one point to Giselle, and if you don't get the timing right, she will just throw you into the fucking abyss, and that's it. That's where it ends. That's ending 4, a moment of hesitation. So this story is based on that ending. And we're going to get the context of that throwing into the abyss part here in a second, but I just thought I should explain that this is non-canon, but it's so good. Okay. How can you be sure that even now I still love you? Can you deny the possibility that I no longer yearn for you, but the white-haired girl? Can you deny the possibility that my love for you has transformed into hate? Farewell, Michelle. In a brief moment of hesitation, Michelle had abandoned Giselle, leading to the worst possible outcome for the both of them. The both of them, and one other as well, a young girl. The girl, however, remained oblivious to her fate.
Are you sure you really wanted to let him go?
The girl leaned back in a rocking chair before the fireplace, tracing her bottom lip with her skeletal finger. Her face was covered in hideous scars, a fitting look for the witch of the cursed mansion, but it was her devilish smile that left the strongest impact. The maid, who now remembered she was Giselle, was putting kindling on the fire, a task she had done countless times over hundreds of years. But this time the circumstances were slightly different.
Yes, I am sure.
Giselle looked up at the witch, distraught. Her already unnaturally pale face was almost entirely devoid of color. Just moments earlier she had banished the man she loved. She had cast Michelle's soul back into the void, sending it off with a wish that he would never find his way back to this mansion.
I see,
the witch said, still running her finger across her lip.
I don't think I'll ever understand. If you hate someone, you should chain them down and torture them for all eternity. It was the perfect opportunity to trap his soul.
I do not hate him, Giselle said, causing the witch's bony finger to come to a sudden halt. The witch raised an eyebrow, perplexed, but it was hidden in the shadow of her hood for no one to see.
Oh, is that so, my dear? After everything you said, I simply assumed.
I could never come to hate him. I could never want to see him dead or tortured. As she spoke, the look of dejection on Giselle's face deepened. However, there seemed to be a hint of relief beneath it, which the witch couldn't comprehend. Oh boy. Okay.
Oh, then why did you say what you did?
The witch extended her skeletal finger toward Giselle. Giselle sighed, saying, I don't think you would understand. Sometimes you kept your distance from someone because you loved them. You sent them back to the mortal realm to live a normal life away from you, an undying apparition, because you loved them. You never wanted them to set foot in the cursed mansion again because you loved them. The witch would never understand those desires. She would never understand telling someone, I don't love you, because you loved them. And she would never understand lying to push someone away because you loved them.
Probably not, the witch said. I'm not particularly interested in understanding either. It doesn't matter what happened in the interim. In the end, nothing's changed, hasn't, my dear? You are still my darling, devoted maid. With enough time, you will once again forget your name.
Giselle slowly closed her eyes. The witch was right. In time, the mansion would eat away at her until there was once again nothing left. However, she no longer felt any fear about losing herself again. Giselle had no one to wait for anymore, which meant she was free from having to despair about him never showing up now. She didn't regret her choice either. As she had shown Michel the events of her own past, she had come to realize that she was no longer that person. That she was merely an unsettling shadow of the woman he had known. And she didn't want to subject him to that. It's for the best. Giselle repeated that phrase to herself again and again. A devilish smile arose to the witch's lips as she watched her gaze slowly sink to the cold floor.
What a wonderful world this is,
she said. She was in complete control of everything, after all. The cursed mansion existed outside of reality, an eternal prison where time held no meaning. What one soul perceived as a day could be a second or a year for another soul. The witch Morgana awoke from a long rest. She opened her eyes, and there was the fireplace crackling away. Before it knelt a woman with deathly pale skin, feeding the fire with kindling. Morgana had no idea where the maid got the wood.
Oh, hello there. Good morning.
The witch snorted.
Good morning to you as well, my dear,
Morgana said.
How long has it been?
Since when?
Since you cast him out.
Cast who out? The maid said with her usual smile, tilting her head. Which was all Morgana needed to hear to know what had happened.
It's been long enough for you to have fully reverted, I see.
Whatever do you mean? The maid asked.
Oh, is this one of your riddles? When have I ever given a riddle? You're the one who likes to make everything you say sound mysterious, my dear.
My, if you say so.
Are you trying to agitate me?
Of course not. Now, would you like to start your day with a cup of herbal tea? Morgana sighed. It seemed the maid had indeed fully reverted. She'd had this exchange every single time she woke up since the maid's mind had broken. And even though her own sense of time had dulled as well, having to answer the same questions over and over again was still frustrating. She was the one who had broken the maid's mind in the first place, though, so she also understood she had brought this on herself.
I've told you this again and again. I don't need any tea.
And what about breakfast? Excuse me. The maid asked.
I don't need food either, as I've also told you repeatedly.
The maid pursed her lips into a little pout.
Any food or tea you prepare is nothing but the product of a deluded spirit's imagination, and I would cast myself into the void before touching that,
the witch thought, sighing. Then will you be doing your usual rounds of the house? The maid asked.
I suppose,
the girl said, gazing up at the dark ceiling. Her only real pastime was visiting the three souls trapped here and tormenting them. Sometimes with words, sometimes with visions of the past, and sometimes with her own two hands. Gradually, bit by bit, she chipped away at their souls. As the master of the house, it acted to serve her will, and that influence was especially powerful while it existed outside of time. Which meant she could do almost anything she pleased. And she had taken full advantage of that ability to torture the souls of the flaxen-haired boy, the beast-like swordsman, and the monstrous lord. She was more than willing to spend the rest of eternity exacting her revenge on the three of them. That said, she felt like things were getting a bit repetitive, and with Michel banished, there was no longer any hope of outside entertainment, which left her the only one with the power to mix things up.
It might be time to send them out again.
The maid blinked at her, perplexed. But of course she wouldn't understand. She didn't know about the three souls imprisoned here. Are you going to release something from the mansion? The maid asked quizzically.
I would never,
the witch said, cackling.
They've been placed under a powerful curse, a wish of destruction and reconstruction. And I am going to begin that process again, have them live their third lives. Oh, I can't wait to see what terrible ends they meet this time. Aren't you excited, my dear?
Yes, very much so, the maid said, smiling as though she hadn't understood a single word. The witch jumped to her feet, giddy with rancor. Imagining the miserable, bloody futures the three terrible men would surely meet had fixed her mood in an instant. They had to suffer for all eternity. They had to endure a fate worse than death. They had to pay for their sins. Over and over and over again. Morgana first went to visit the flaxen-haired boy, whose soul was imprisoned in the rose garden. As she approached the double doors, they opened on their own, the rusty hinges letting out pained shrieks. On the other side lay a colorless, withered garden, a sad shadow of its once brilliant, colorful splendor. Of course, the witch felt no heartache over the garden's state of decay. A boy's shadow knelt on the ground, almost entirely encased in a briar patch. It was wispy and barely managed to retain its human form. Arms wrapped around his head, he muttered endlessly to himself. "It's not all my fault. I can't take this anymore. Someone get me out of here." There's a siren in the background, like, "They're coming for you, Mel." They got you now. For your bitch crimes. Morgana stuck her chin out, looking down on the pathetic creature before her. Her last time here, he had been a bit more coherent, but now he seemed to be hardly there at all. The flaxen-haired boy's punishment was to relive the day that had started it, over and over again. He had to watch dozens of people die during the Harvest Festival celebration, including his own sister. And now that he'd finished his second life as well, she made him watch his mistakes from that as well. Such as the time he called his sister disgusting and pushed her away, the very same sister he betrayed the lakeside witch for. "I never could have known that would happen. I just wanted a normal life. Someone, please, get me out of here."
"Would you like me to set you free?"
the witch asked. Only then did the shadow notice her presence, looking up at her with his featureless, empty face. "What?" The witch's smirk grew wider.
"I said I'm thinking of releasing you."
If the flaxen-haired boy had any strength left to think, he would have realized that this was all a trick, not a sudden display of kindness. But all he could see was an opportunity to escape, and he was going to take it. "Please, let me go." He didn't even so much as wonder why. The only thing that registered in his feeble mind was the word free. Nothing else mattered as long as he could escape this place. The witch's devilish smirk widened even further.
"Very well. Then I shall deliver your soul to its rightful place. You are very fortunate to have this chance to return to the mortal realm, my dear."
"Thank you so much for your forgiveness." A contorted smile rose to the flaxen-haired boy's face. He then whisked away into nothing, leaving behind only a small breeze to rustle the witch's robe. It took all her strength not to burst out laughing. "Thank you for your forgiveness? That was brilliant. She hadn't said a thing about forgiving him."
"Farewell, Mel,"
the witch said, tracing her lip with her bone finger.
"We'll meet again soon,"
she said. The witch's parting words this time were not until our souls crossed paths once more in the boundless sphere of fate. Because she hadn't released him from the curse, so his fate was still bound to her, even as he began life anew. And so long as he remained subject to the curse, so did the soul of the girl who meant so much to him. Oh boy. Next, the witch went to visit the swordsman. His soul was imprisoned in the cellar, from which the stench of blood and flesh emanated. After losing his mind, the twisted killer began destroying everything in sight while howling in some incomprehensible tongue, perhaps his native language, perhaps not a human language at all. The witch was, in truth, not looking forward to this visit. While the cursed mansion was indeed her own domain, her own little realm of the dead, she was still just a regular soul herself. If he were to catch her off guard, he could very well damage her soul beyond repair. The witch held the greatest grudge against the barbaric lord, but she remained the most cautious around the swordsman. With an exasperated sigh, she opened the cellar door. And, exactly as she expected, a barely humanoid beast leapt to her the second she did.
Stop this instant!
She shouted, pointing a bony finger at the beast. In the realm of the dead, it was willpower, not physical strength, that ruled, which meant that while the witch had been a helpless girl in life, she was the most powerful being in this domain. At her command, the beast froze mid-motion, a katana held high above his head. He stared wide-eyed at the small girl standing before him, beads of sweat forming on his neck. The beast shouted something in some inhuman tongue. The witch glanced around the cellar. It was littered with corpses, bloodstains on every surface. Perhaps among the bodies was even the woman he called his tether. The witch turned her golden eyes back to the beast. In life, she had been terrified of this man. So scared that she had resorted to opening her door for the flaxen-haired boy, hoping to ask for his assistance. But now there was no fear, only glee at having him entirely under her thumb.
How would you like it if I returned you to the realm of the living?
She asked with a devilish grin. The beast stared at her blankly, his form shifting into something faintly more human.
You're still torn between your two greatest desires, aren't you? You thirst for blood, and yet you crave a quiet life at the same time. You've already fallen once, lived as a beast, but that wasn't enough to satisfy you. So perhaps the only way to quench your thirst is with the other desire, peace and quiet. And I'm offering you another chance to have that.
Do you mean it? The shadow's hands were trembling. It took the witch everything in her power to not start cackling at the sight. That abhorrent killer shaking like a lamb.
Yes, I mean it,
she said with a smile. The katana fell from the beast's hands, letting out a high-pitched, loud clang when it hit the hard floor. As the sound echoed in the cellar, it sounded almost like 1,000 ghosts screaming.
So you do want to go back to being a man after all?
The shadow dropped its head in a crude imitation of a nod. A hideous beast and his most benevolent savior. It was a scene that could have easily taken place between him and the white-haired girl in his second life. Of course, the witch's intentions were nothing like hers. And by the witch's mercy, the beast was freed. With his disappearance, the countless bodies stacked up in the cellar vanished as if they had never been there. Only the smell of blood remained to remind her of the carnage. The witch then burst out laughing, unable to hold it back any longer.
Oh, that was brilliant! Do you really think you'll ever be able to find peace? No, you'll just kill whoever holds you back and descend into madness no matter how much you resist. And this time, you're going to turn on everyone on you and die a sad, miserable, gruesome death.
Her cackling echoed in the cold cellar for some time. Oh boy. Oh boy. Her final stop was to see the man she despised more than anyone, the Lord. That monstrous savage. The mere thought of him filled her head with the pitch-black rage. He had ruined her life and tainted her soul. He was the cruelest, most barbaric of all of them. He held disgusting blood sabbats, turning a saint into a spectacle. The witch despised all three men, but her loathing for the Lord, the ultimate root of her suffering, was far, far greater than the other two. She made her way to the den on the second floor. Cigarette smoke seeped out into the hallway, a smell as sad as the man waiting inside. When she opened the door, a cloud of smoke escaped, and only then was she able to see inside. Sitting on the edge of the billiards table with his head drooped was the third shadow, again barely able to maintain a human form. A few seconds later, he noticed the witch's presence and stumbled off the table, shuffling precariously towards her. He extended a hand for her in grief and overwhelming regret, but the witch only saw it as a threat. He was trying to hurt her, as he had done so many times in life, to save himself.
Don't you dare touch me,
she said, causing his hand to freeze in the air. It formed the chasm between them, boundlessly wide and unfathomably deep. One he would never be able to cross.
Rejoice, Lord,
the witch said with a devilish grin.
I'm setting your soul free.
The shadow just stood there, staring at her. He didn't rejoice at the news, and in fact seemed to be rather upset by it. He opened his mouth to try to say something, but only strained gasps escaped from his lips. The witch tilted her head. The other two had been thrilled to hear they were being set free, so she was not expecting this reaction.
Ah,
she said with a nod.
I see what it is. You realize that this was a trick and that I'm really sending you out to your third doom. I suppose being the Lord for so long, you would need a sense of danger.
The man was desperately trying to communicate something to her, but with each attempt to use his voice, it only got less and less comprehensible. If he couldn't speak, then he would have to try something else. So he dragged his legs forward toward the witch.
You will never lay another finger on me,
she commanded, pointing a skeletal finger at the shadow's feet. Heavy black chains, strongly reminiscent of those that had been used to seal the observation door tower, appeared from the floor and wrapped themselves around his ankles, digging deep into his skin. The shadow fell to his knees, and the sound of rattling metal echoed in the den.
Oh, what a sorry sight. The former lord of a large territory and the head of a mafia family on his hands and knees, utterly helpless. How does it feel being looked down on by a mere commoner? It must be absolutely humiliating.
The shadow screamed, still mostly indecipherable, but more so than before. His intense desire to get through to her was beginning to show an effect. The witch cackled, glaring down at the pathetic creature before her. She knew how prideful a man he was. He was undoubtedly trying to assail her with curses and promises of vengeance. And oh, how delightful it would be to completely break him.
Go on, my dear. Tell me how much you despise me. Take it nice and slow. You can do it.
She crouched before the shadow, peering into his eyes. He didn't have a face to read an expression from, but she could still feel his desperation. He groaned and grunted until finally he was able to form words.
I want to make amends.
The witch froze. It took her several seconds to comprehend what he had just said. Had he just asked to make amends? The Lord, the man who had held those dreadful blood sabbats, tortured slaves for fun, and was concerned about only satisfying his own desires, wanted to atone? For what purpose? I made you into the witch. I will do anything you want. I want to make amends.
Shut up.
The witch stepped back away from the Lord. She was rattled, and her face contorted in confusion, luckily hidden by her hood. Right, this was just a ploy to escape from her curse. He was offering atonement in the hope that she would show him mercy. Well, he was a fool. She had no mercy to spare. The only thing she had in her heart was boundless hatred. Having regained her composure, the witch decided she would make him pay for attempting to worm his way free with an empty show of grace. She turned her gaze toward the shadow-cloaked ceiling and made a wish. In her mind, she envisioned the longsword the Lord had held above her head, and a few moments later that very blade descended from the void. The time-worn sword rattled to the floor beside the Lord. Raising her fleshless arm, the witch pointed at the blade with a smirk.
If you wish to atone for what you've done, you will have to suffer the same pain as I did. Take the blade, and with it sever your own left arm. And should you refuse, that proves you a heartless tyrant only capable of
hurting others, she meant to say, but couldn't finish. The sound of spilled unbidden from her lips as a massive shadow made a thump against the dense carpet. Jet black liquid spurted from his left shoulder, staining the area around him. He hadn't even hesitated. What next? The shadow plunged the bloody sword into the ground, leaning against the hilt for support. He was breathing heavily from the pain, but still he asked for more, knowing a single arm didn't compare to the agony she had been made to endure. The witch stared at him, flabbergasted. What on earth was happening? Was this the kind of man the Lord was? No, forget that. Regardless of whatever he was doing now, he still had her locked in the observation tower and killed her. He was a brutal, savage murderer, and nothing changed that. He had to be. He had to be. What do you want me to do next? What will bring you relief? Morgana.
Silence!
The witch's mind was a mess. Something seemed wrong, but her soul refused to let her see what. Pain that she had long since buried was drifting back to the surface. As anger and hatred bubbled furiously in her gut, she twisted her lips into a smile and proclaimed,
Very well, then. As you wish, I'll let you experience the full extent of the pain and helplessness I was made to suffer.
And so, she put the Lord through all the pain and suffering and despair she had gone through in life, covering his body in wounds from head to toe and draping the den in a thick layer of black blood. It was the witch's very own blood sabbath. The black shadow lay in a twisted mound in the center of the sea of blood, occasional strained gurgles, the only sign anything remained inside. He had endured the entirety of her 16 years of life in the tiniest fraction of that time, and as a result, his soul was on the brink of disappearance. The witch was breathing heavily as well. In the process of administering his punishment, she had had to relive it all as well, creating brand new wounds on her soul. It had been centuries since she'd last been hurt by her past.
That's enough, she said. I'm sending your soul back out into the world so you can begin your third life, and your third tragedy. I will never let your suffering end.
Coughing up blood, the shadow lifted his head, shaking it weakly. He didn't object to the suffering, only doing it in the mortal realm. It had to be here, with her, where she could see it. He had so much he wanted to say, but only the strength left in his lips to put one sentiment into words. That he wanted to atone, of course. That was the only thing he truly desired. The witch bit her lip. These incomprehensible feelings he kept dragging out of her were driving her mad. And the very fact that she was unable to retain her composure was only a source of further agitation.
Are you incapable of saying anything else? If you're capable of feeling remorse, why would you do any of that to me in the first place? Why did you hold all those blood sabbaths? Why did you make a spectacle out of me? Why did you torture your slaves for fun? Why did you call me a witch? Why did you lock me up and murder me?
He likely wanted to tell her she was wrong, but because not everything she had said was false, he couldn't. And he didn't have the strength or clarity of mind to explain it in detail. So all he could do was cling to his self-destructive wish for atonement.
I will never be able to understand you, Lord.
The witch's mental state was beginning to shift again. Not for the better, though. The only person capable of untangling the massive knot that had formed was no longer around, which meant it would only continue to get more and more tangled. And she was starting to think she'd rather be rid of him entirely than have him suffer for all eternity. The longer she kept him around, the more chances he would have to beg to make amends. But she was done with that. She was done with the Lord's nonsense. And she was done with feeling like such a mess because of him.
Okay then. As you wish. This wasn't part of my plan, but I'll let you have your final atonement.
As she spoke, she bent down and picked up the sword with her skeletal hand.
By giving me your head.
He didn't object, and he didn't try to run. Instead, he pushed himself up with his right arm, dropping his head and exposing his neck for her. Morgana looked down on him with disgust. She tightened her grip on the sword, pretending not to notice the faint trembling in her hand.
Farewell, Lord. May your soul be forever extinguished from this world.
With those words, she ended the Lord's life once and for all. And with his death, the truth scattered into the wind. Morgana's robe was heavy with black blood. She was exhausted. She thought having her revenge would take a huge weight off her shoulders, but instead she just felt lethargic. She wanted to get back to the warmth of the fireplace and go down for another nice long sleep. But when she opened the door to the hallway,
"Have you finished your business?"
she came face to face with the maid, her jade eyes glimmering unnaturally. Morgana took a half step back. What was she getting spooked for? She was the most powerful being in this domain. She was in complete control. The witch gave a little humph to mask her momentary stubble, then said,
"Yes, I finished. Now tell me, is the fireplace going? I'm rather tired and would like to rest." "But of course, Morgana. I put fresh kindling on the fire not long ago. It should be nice and warm for your nap." "Very well."
Morgana lowered her gaze and made to leave the maid behind. But then she realized something seemed very wrong.
How does the maid know my name?
A chill ran down her back. If the maid's mind was still broken, she would never call Morgana by that name. because she believed it to be her own. Cold jade eyes remained fixed on Golden. A smile spread across the maid's lips. The witch could not, though.
Are you Giselle?
If so, why? Why would she pretend to be mad if she still retained herself? What was her objective? Why was she wearing that unsettling smile if she was Giselle? Who on earth was she? For the first time, she felt something like fear for the maid, for Giselle. She was the witch, though. She was supposed to be the one everyone else feared. She was the master of the house. She was the most powerful being in this tiny domain. So why did she feel like Giselle of all people had taken the upper hand? She had to have been imagining it. Giselle was her faithful maid, and she was the all-powerful witch. However, that dynamic only existed as it did because Giselle had Michel to wait for. Her one source of hope and her weakness. But now that he was gone, and Giselle no longer had any hope, would she really stay in Morgana's servitude for eternity?
While you were asleep, I spent some time organizing my thoughts. Is that so?
The witch said. It is. After Hayden's death, you told me of the 3 men who wronged you, and of your enmity for them.
That may have happened, yes.
And then you told me how you made a wish for them. A wish that they would undergo reconstruction and meet their tragic demises again.
Yes, what of it?
Something about it doesn't quite sit right with me. I have only heard the events from your perspective, though, so I can only speculate on what it means. But a story told from one perspective is necessarily colored by that perspective. If the speaker believes something, it becomes true within that telling, regardless of the reality of it. I am quite familiar with this phenomenon, as I have fallen into its trap before.
What are you implying? Are you trying to say that I'm wrong about what happened to me?
I cannot say. And the only one who could is no longer with us. Any chance we had of knowing the truth is now lost forever. However, unlike you, I was there with all 3 of them for their second lives. And in particular, my impression of the man in the 3rd door, who you refer to as the Lord, does not line up with your depiction of him in certain ways. Would you really call him a heartless monster?
Why wouldn't I?
The witch said.
He passed goblets of my blood around to noblemen like wine. Does that sound like someone who has a heart?
Giselle didn't back down in the face of Morgana's intense glare. In fact, she took another step closer. Morgana was starting to feel like she was at a disadvantage, despite full confidence she was right. And what if you were mistaken about some fundamental detail?
Mistaken?
No, there was nothing to mistake. The Lord was a monster. He was one when he drained her blood for feasts, and he was one when he locked her in the tower. That was the simple truth of it. Why then did she feel like her chest was in a vice every time she told herself that? Why had her hands shaken before killing him? And why on earth did her mind keep imagining him begging to atone as someone completely unrelated? For a heartbeat, a vision of that lonely graveyard swelled up in her mind. Standing there was the slave man, whose name and face and voice she had long forgotten. The one who had taught her kindness. I chose not to stop you, though, Giselle said. And why do you think I did that?
Enough games. Out with it already. What are you scheming?
Oh, I would never. I simply wanted one thing.
For you to lose everything as well.
The witch glowered at Giselle, who was still wearing the same lonely smile. She had no idea what that inscrutable woman was trying to say. She had already lost everything. That was what had driven her to become the spiteful witch in the first place, drifting outside time for all eternity. Giselle placed a hand on the witch's cheek. Jade and golden eyes locked, mere inches apart. And there, the witch gazed into the eyes of another witch. You surrendered yourself to hatred, becoming a witch who brandishes curses. And I surrendered myself to solitude, becoming a witch who brandishes desolation. This is a world too painful to live in if you don't love solitude, after all.
No, there's only one witch, me.
And why might you think that?
Because I'm the one who started it all. I'm the one who created this mansion, and I am its master. I bear more hatred than anyone. I'm the one.
As departed souls, we're formed by our will and our emotions. How do you know my despair? Sorrow and solitude aren't stronger than the hatred that makes you. And then, with an unsettlingly cold smile that radiated pure emptiness, the smile of the true witch, she offered the girl one final thought. Can you be certain the lord you killed was the same lord? And with those words, that tiny insignificant realm became devoid of even pain. What the fuck? Hey, one question. What the fuck? There's a lot to unpack with those two stories, but that one especially. First of all, I love when cheerful people become villainous, antagonistic. I love that. My fave. Because Giselle's like the last person that you would expect to do anything like that. Something so mean. And then Morgana fucking killing Jacopo. Not even knowing. It's fucked up. It's really fucked up. It's really fucked up. And he lets her do it. Like, God, they are both so blinded by their emotions that they just let each other eat each other alive, essentially. And that's always been true through all the stories that we've read, and with the exception of reincarnation finally getting like a good ending, but like this really highlights that, and it's so awful to think about. I just think that that's amazing writing for just a side ending that you kind of laugh at because, you know, it's the timed one, so you have to do it real quick or else, you know, got yeeted into the void because I didn't click it fast enough. Nope, actually, the ending that would lead to is really fucking harrowing. I can't take any more for today. That's all I can take for today. I ended up going for 2 hours. I got into it. I'm awake. I'm gonna go cry. Anyway, I'll be back on Sunday with Grandia 2, assuming my sleep schedule doesn't get completely whacked again. Hopefully not. And then next week, these, if memory serves, these 4 are quite short. Or at least these 3. No, these 2 are definitely short. This one especially is like the shortest. And then this one. This one's not too long. I don't remember this one. And then the rest, I have no fucking idea. I'm real excited though. Is this gonna be, I hope this is about Hayden. Please. But yeah. Tomorrow's American Thanksgiving. If you're going to be doing holiday things, please be responsible. You know. So, why is it not letting me? Okay, well, whatever. Anyway, I'm gonna go. Okay, I'm gonna go. Be safe out there. Be good to yourself. Be good to others. You know the drill. Oh God, I'm so broken.